Hello again, class. Here we are for the second of two lectures for Thursday, the 26th of March. In the last lecture, I talked about the development of the English colonies and how the English finally got something going in Jamestown, founded in 1607. After 1611, they realized that tobacco was going to be their main resource, and that had significant consequences for the development of the colony, especially in their relations with Native Americans and their overall economic expansion. Okay, but tobacco is an incredibly labor-intensive crop, and therefore the decision to focus their economics on a labor-intensive cash crop would eventually have some significant results in the labor force, which will be the main topic that we'll be talking about tonight. So our goal here for the second of two lectures, and this one will be significantly shorter. This stands alone as a topic, although it could be integrated into the other one, but I think it's important enough to be its own separate issue. We'll be talking about the English development of slavery and how they built on the existing African slavery that the Portuguese and then Spanish and French and other Europeans had already developed starting in the 1400s. So, before we get into the specifics in the Jamestown colony and the Chesapeake more generally, I think it's first good to back up a little bit and just think about England and some of the ideas about race that they developed there. So you have to keep in mind, England, of course, is although a European nation, is fairly isolated from much of the center of Europe based on where it is. It's off the northwest corner of Europe, and although not as isolated as, for example, the Scandinavians, still was fairly far afield historically from the main part of Europe and especially from Mediterranean Europe in southern Europe, which meant that in the days before the kinds of transportation and exploration and trade that began to pick up in the 1300s or so, England was fairly isolated. Most of its trade was either across the Channel to the French and the Dutch and in Flanders, or on the other side of the Irish Sea with the Irish, or with the other nations eventually brought into the UK, so the Scottish, the Welsh, etc. So England was fairly isolated. Although a maritime country, it didn't really have, and this is key to this story here, it didn't really have an African experience. Unlike, for example, the Portuguese or the Spanish or all the various Italian folks or other peoples who had a Mediterranean part of their country, those historically were people who had had contact with and knowledge of the people of the various parts of Africa. England, not so at all. And so, although they were aware to some extent that Africa existed, still interaction with people of African background was not something that was at all common. And therefore, we can really track what it was like for the English people to begin to come in contact with folks from various parts of Africa, from various civilizations in Africa, because it happens almost in real time. Um, the initial contact, for example, of people from Spain with various peoples from Africa happened so long ago that we have very little idea what that was like, and uh, and what it was, how that transition happened. But for England, it was really, really a stark thing, and something that we can track in the really in significant ways through the culture and the history that we know of the English people in the 15 and into the 1600s. So what that means is that we really can see in the development of the English language some of the ideas about difference and about race that I talked about previously that were already developing as slavery began to come into existence. So to remind you, slavery was an old concept that got developed in a more serious and ultimately catastrophic way, starting with the Portuguese in the 1400s, and then other Europeans got into African slavery as a big business, a tragic business, where millions ultimately of Africans and then their descendants were forced into slavery with huge numbers, much harsher treatment, and then ultimately a race based justification for it. So, if you've ever thought about the terms that are traditionally used to describe in the English language people of different backgrounds, and for example, if you have kids or have ever been in this conversation with a kid, one question that always comes up is, mom, dad, Why do we call some people black? Why do we call some people white? In that definition, the way the language works, the way the English language works, I would be defined as white, even though the reality is, I'm kind of pasty, but pinkish a little bit in complexion. And people who would be described in the English language as black um, obviously have darker pigment than I do, but are not in any way the color of the night sky. So um, this came about because of the starkness of the difference that the English began to realize when they first encountered people from Africa, as the age of exploration really opened them up um, to people from other parts of the world in significant numbers. And so you can track this, as I say, in the literature, in the writings, and so forth that we have from late 1400s, definitely through the 1500s, and even through the early 1600s, even Shakespeare's plays and so forth. Um, by defining people from Africa or of African background as black, and by defining people of European background as white, the English were first of all denoting a difference. They are emphasizing, in some ways, a surprise that there are people in the world who don't look the same as them, and emphasizing that difference. White and black are obviously opposites. In the color wheel, one is the absence of all color, one is the presence of all color, or what have you. So, difference is clearly the first thing that's being emphasized by the use of the terminology. But when the English chose those particular denotations for people whose backgrounds came from different continents, the English also were including moral definitions. In the English literature and ideology of the time, white was a color that was associated with God, with godliness. Saints are white, virgins are white, purity is white. Whereas, in contradistinction, the color black was something that culturally was defined as dark, as evil. Uh, Black is the color of fear. It's the color of the night forest when the animals of the forest may be coming to get you. It is the color of the devil. It is the color of hell. And so, therefore, in the English language, terms that are still brought down today and used just commonly without thinking about the moral underlaying of them, in the English language, when English people defined themselves as white and defined people from Africa or of African background as black, what they were doing was not just saying, I look different than you and you look different from me. What they're saying is, I am better than you. I am more moral than you. I am more godly than you. I am closer to God than you. You are morally empty. You are morally bankrupt. You are more of the God, of the sin, of the devil. Partly, there's a cultural and religious thing going on here because the English, as was the case for essentially all the Europeans, believed that anyone who was not Christian, like themselves, was doomed to hell because anyone who was not Christian had not been baptized and therefore, upon death, would not be allowed to go into heaven. But partly, this is a true moral judgment, as the English are using terms that already existed and laying them on top of uh, ethnic differences, cultural differences, and just simply skin color differences as a way to help define the possibility of, among other things, of the enslavement of people from Africa. It would be much harder for the English to justify enslaving people who they didn't define as morally empty, as dark, as evil, as associated with the devil. And much harder for them to justify doing that enslaving if they weren't defining themselves as godly and pure. So the terminology matters a lot. And again, a lot of that has to do, and we can track that because of the fact that the English were relatively isolated and therefore had their first significant encounters with people from Africa at around the same time that the enslavement in millions of people, ultimately, of African peoples, began to happen, that the English are going to eventually be playing, tragically, a very large role in. Okay, religion was clearly part of that story, as I just implied, and so there is an additional religious justification for slavery that the English, in particular, tended to emphasize more than some of the excuse me, more than some of the other European countries or ethnic groups. The English made a big deal in their discussion of this topic of a story from the book of Genesis. So this is from chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. It's the story of Noah. And this is a fairly familiar story. I'm going to, dig into a little bit of here. But you may have seen the films, even if you aren't familiar with it from your own religious studies or just from having read the story in the Bible. It's a pretty well-known story. But basically, the way it goes is that, and the book of Genesis is from the very early days of humanity, but enough had happened, civilizations had been created by the descendants of Adam and Eve, that at that point, things had started to go badly. And some of the humans, the people on Earth, the ones created by God in the Bible, they were just not following the rules. They were sinful. They were just not in any way the kind of people that God wanted. But there was one exception. There was a family led by the patriarch named Noah, who was godly, who was following the moral code that had been handed down. And so, as the book of Genesis tells the story, God got in touch with Noah, reached out to him, not via phone, but just sort of appeared to him. Got to imagine this was a pretty scary, exciting, but mostly terrifying event for Noah. He was directly told by God that God was angry with humanity, that God was going to destroy all of humanity, with the exception of Noah and his family, who were the only godly ones all of humanity. And to protect themselves from this destruction, that Noah was ordered to build an ark, a large ship. On that, he would not only put himself and his family, but also representatives of one of each of the genders of the animals that existed on Earth. And then once that was done, then at that point, God would proceed to destroy the rest of humanity. So, a flood. A flood is coming. And Noah then went about making this ark, building this in his front lawn or wherever. You can imagine the conversations that he may have had with his neighbors. They probably were a little curious what he was doing. Probably not much he could say to them. Kind of a top secret gig. He can't let them on board after the flood begins. So, he can't really tell them what he's doing in the meantime, because then they might make their own ark. Probably the best he could do is say, well, learn to swim. Then, after the ark was built, and somehow all these animals, two of each, leopards and cheetahs and birds and so forth, after they had come onto the ark, then the flood began. As the Bible tells the story, 40 days and 40 nights of rains commenced, uh, during which the seas rose and ultimately all the other people drowned. You can imagine what a traumatic event this would have been for the people on board. And Noah has been given this tremendous, tremendous authority and responsibility, but it also must have been very terrifying to live through. And of course, very sad, because all of his neighbors, all of his distant relatives, all the other people, they are literally drowning. In some cases, one would imagine, trying to get on board the boat and so forth. It would have been incredibly traumatic. Then, after those 40 days and 40 nights of rain, once all the humans had been drowned and wiped out, other than Noah and his family on board the boat, then the waters receded. The ark settled back to the ground. The animals went about and did their thing and repropagated the world. And then Noah and his family were responsible for doing likewise for humanity. And the final word here from God is that Noah and his family were going to start things again, but this time it was important to make sure that the humans who came after them understood that they did indeed have to follow the rules of moral behavior as set down by God. So, whether or not you believe in the actual literal truth of this story or not, that's a powerful story that was told and learned by Christians for centuries, and prior to that by Jews, because the story goes back to the ancient Jewish faith. So, after this is all over, after Noah has been given this edict by God to recreate civilization and to make sure that it works this time, the incredible responsibility that he must have felt, and the implication is that if it doesn't work out, that God will come back and destroy again, and this time he won't be so nice. You can imagine what Noah must have been feeling. And so it is, to me, not a huge surprise that immediately after that, the next thing we know of Noah is that he's drunk. Specifically, he's drunk in his tent. And this is in the early days after the ark had been depopulated, and they're trying to rebuild civilization. So pretty rustic, just getting things started up again. I have to say that I can feel what Noah's feeling. I myself have probably had a beer or two since our dark days have started, and I am nowhere near and feeling the kind of responsibility that Noah does. So I can justify it, even though y'all are just college students, so don't be doing this kind of behavior. Now, Noah is also naked, and I don't know what to say about that, other than he's been going through a lot. I would say that probably if there were psychiatrists around, that they would probably say that he could be diagnosed with some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, um, and so maybe making decisions that in other circumstances that he wouldn't have. But anyway, he's drunk. He's face down in his tent. He has not a stitch of clothing on, and I imagine probably moaning or whatever in the tent. And meanwhile, outside, so in addition to Noah and his wife, there are his three sons and their wives, and that's somehow going to repopulate humanity. Won't worry about the genetics of that. But anyway, the three sons are standing outside the tent trying to figure out what's going on with Dad. So the three sons are Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Ham is the eldest, and so therefore the other two kind of look to him. And so Ham goes in to see what's going on with their father Noah. Goes into the tent, immediately sees what's going on. There's his dad lying there. He stinks to all high heaven. He's been drinking, who knows, plum wine or something like that. He's clearly drunk out of his mind. He's got no clothing on at all. And then Ham goes back out of the tent and tells the other two brothers what he's seen. Well, Dad's in there, and whew, man, he stinks. And he's going to have a heck of a hangover when he wakes up, and he's also got no clothes on at all. And oh, I don't believe what I just saw. Um, and the other two brothers ask him, well, what did you do? And Ham's like, what do you mean, what did I do? I mean, I just told you what happened. I went in, I looked at him, I saw what happened, I came out and told you. And the other two brothers, who, let's be honest, if they'd gone in first, would have probably acted the way Ham did. But anyway, the other two brothers, who had a moment to think about it, realized that when their father woke up, that he would not only have a terrible headache, but he would be very embarrassed, that he'd be humiliated, because he had really lowered himself in a way that he would feel much shame the next day. So the two other brothers, realizing that there's at least one thing they could do for their father, they went into the tent and didn't look at Noah, but they covered him up, so that at least in the morning when he woke up with a raging headache, that he would feel a little bit less embarrassed. Because to wake up drunk or hungover is one thing, but to wake up and not know where your clothes are, that's quite another. So Noah did indeed wake up the next day and came out of the tent, sort of all furry-eyed or whatever, and said, "Oh, what happened? Oh, man, whatever." And eventually, the story came out that, well, he was drunk in his tent, and Ham went in, and then Ham came out and told the other two, and the other two came in and they covered him up. And Noah thinks about this for a moment, and then he realizes that this had been a test, not a test of himself for some reason. Apparently, he still thinks that he is God's chosen one, and therefore anything he does is okay. But instead, really a test of the other guys, the other parts of his community. Because after all, God has warned them that they need to follow the rules and they need to be morally upright in every possible way. Well, Ham came in and saw his father and then came out again, and Shem and Japheth came in and covered up their father. And therefore, Ham had failed a test, and Shem and Japheth had passed it. And therefore, after thinking this over, Noah decided that Ham, for failing this test, must be banished. So the family split up at this point. Noah, the patriarch, the one who had saved them all, Noah turned to Ham and said, "You are banished. Take you and your wife, and you are going to go away from us. We're going to rebuild civilization here. We're going to get things started up again the right way here. But you're gone. And furthermore, if we or any of our descendants ever see you or any of your descendants again, I curse you that you and your descendants will be servants of serpents." And Ham goes away. Shem and Japheth and Noah, they begin to rebuild their lives. Now, that's essentially how the story ends, and I just told the 10-minute version of what's, 7 lines in the Bible. Um, but the English read this story, and they were thoroughly convinced that it explained the differences in ethnic background in the world, because it was clear to them that given where the story takes place, which is essentially, the Holy Land, the Middle East, the same places they'd been fighting over in the Crusades a few centuries earlier, the English were convinced that if indeed Ham and his part of his branch of humanity had been banished, that they then must have gone to Africa, and therefore the descendants of Ham were the African people, and the descendants of the good brothers, Shem and Japheth, they were the European people. And therefore, according to this curse laid upon Ham and all of his descendants by Noah, therefore the Europeans were justified in enslaving the Africans because of the curse of Ham laid upon Ham and his descendants by Noah after the ark, and at the end of the story with that part of the Bible. So, furthermore, the English, and they were pretty much the only Europeans to fully emphasize the implications of this story. The English assumed that any curse laid upon Ham and therefore upon Africans by Noah would have the agreement, the go upon by God Himself. And the question, of course, would be, farther down the line, 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever down the line, how would the descendants of the two good sons know if they were encountering the descendants of the bad son? And so the English interpretation of that was, therefore, God, in agreement and in support of Noah's curse, God must have made the descendants of Ham look different from the descendants of the two other brothers. And therefore, the English assumed that as the mark of this curse, that therefore people from Africa had darker skin, because that would make it immediately obvious that they were indeed the descendants of Ham, cursed and cursed to be servants of servants. And I don't know exactly what that phrase is supposed to mean, but the way the English interpreted it was to be slaves. So, with this religious justification, as well as other ethnic and cultural justifications, all built into their definition of themselves and their definition of who they thought people from Africa were, the English then got into slavery and ultimately became the nation that made the most money off of the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants, taking over the biggest part of the African slave trade after about the 1600s or so. And many of the wealthy fortunes that were made in England, a lot of the rich London buildings and so forth, were funded as a result of this international slave trade that the English, really to their detriment, really something that should be incredibly a shameful part of English history, that the English very heavily engaged in. Okay, so with that understanding of the English point of view about slavery and their ideas of race and their sense of how they were different from and they felt better than people from Africa, let's now put that into place by looking at what's going on in these English colonies. So, as I said, tobacco, which was the main economic linchpin of the Chesapeake colonies, starting in Jamestown, tobacco is a very labor intensive crop. If you're going to make money off of it, it requires a lot of effort. And as some people began to make profits from it, their goal was to grow as much of it as they possibly could and sell as much of it as they possibly could on bigger and bigger farms. And the bigger the farm gets, eventually you're talking about a plantation, which is basically a large farm designed for profit to grow mostly one thing to sell. The tobacco plantations are just one example. There are sugar plantations other places. We'll get to cotton plantations in the U.S. later. But the tobacco plantations are going to be the main economic force in and around Jamestown once they realized tobacco was going to be their thing. But tobacco required a lot of labor. Tobacco required a lot of people. If you're going to have a lot of tobacco grown, you need a lot, needs to have the farmer who owns the land needs to have a lot of people involved in growing the tobacco, requires a lot of care throughout the year and an incredible amount of labor, especially during the harvest time. So we know that the English had no problem with slavery. We know that the English believed that people from Africa, it was okay to enslave them and their descendants, and therefore it will not surprise you to hear that slavery was present in Jamestown almost from the very beginning. 1619 is usually the date that's used for the beginning of slavery, of African based slavery in the English colonies. That year, a Dutch trading ship arrived at Jamestown, and among the things that they brought with them were people. There were defined in, and our records are not great, so we have to do a little interpreting here. But they were defined in the shipping manifest as African servants. Whether or not they were directly from Africa or maybe were second or third generation, maybe coming from some of the English colonies in the Caribbean, that seems likely. Whether or not they were fully servants or fully slaves, not clear. Most of the time, we assume that they were slaves, although they may not have fully been. But certainly, these people of African background were put to work because they were purchased essentially, their labor was purchased, that's clear, and then put to use by some of the early Jamestown settlers on some of these early tobacco plantations. We know that's true, if not from that first group, but definitely shortly thereafter, because we do know from the laws that Jamestown created in the years that followed, there began to be laws defining slavery, defining the responsibility of slave owners, defining the restrictions on the rights of the slaves themselves. Those laws begin to be codified in the Jamestown laws in the 1620s. So clearly, slavery was a thing. Clearly, African based slavery was a thing. And so we know that's happening. And yet, the early days of the English colonies, Jamestown, the rest of Virginia, and even eventually when Maryland was established, as well as some of the other English colonies that will be established farther up the coast, the Puritans are going to have slaves as well, unfortunately, but not nearly as many numbers. We know that slavery was part of their labor force, but we also know that the definition of slavery was more slippery, a little bit more loose than it wound up being later. And there's an important historian who recently passed away, a guy named Ira Berlin, who was a historian at the University of Maryland studying the history of slavery over the centuries, who wrote a very important book in the 1990s in which he described a distinction between societies with slaves, which is to say, a society or a culture where slavery exists, and societies that are slave societies, which is to say, a society where slavery is really the key thing, is really the defining feature. And sometimes you can have a slippery slope or maybe a moving dial where there were some cultures that at one point in their development had slavery, but it was not as important to them. And then later on became full on slave societies based on economics or culture or some other thing. So, by that definition, early Jamestown was not a slave society. There really weren't that many slaves at first. And the definition of slavery was somewhat slippery. A way to test that is by looking at what we know of the lives of some of the early Jamestown settlers. And so, one man that we know a lot about his life gives us sort of a test case. His name was Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson arrived in Jamestown in 1621. We know from the records that he was a servant. He was working for a wealthier person. After the term of service was over, there was a contract after which he would be free. After that, he had impressed the person he worked for enough that not only was he given his freedom, but the former boss, the former person that he worked for, put him up with some land and helped him get started with starting his own farm, and then became something of a mentor and a supporter for Anthony Johnson in the years that followed. Anthony Johnson eventually established his own tobacco plantation, became fairly wealthy. We know that over the years that he amassed a fairly large amount of land. He eventually owned a decent number of slaves, African background, and was a regular presence in the law and lawsuits and so forth, which are a lot of our records of the time. We know, for example, that he sued some of his neighbors for property problems or things like that. At one point, he even sued one of his neighbors because he said his neighbors had stolen his slaves. And this was not the regular kind of a lawsuit. This was a civil case where he's basically saying, give back my slave and also pay me for the use of my slave's time. In both cases, he won the lawsuit. Um, when he died in 1674, he left for his heirs a fairly substantial plantation, a fairly large amount of a big plantation, a fairly large amount of wealth, and a couple dozen or so slaves who they inherited as property the same way, unfortunately, scarily, horrifyingly, the same way any other kind of property would be transferred in any other kind of sort of legal case. The thing that I didn't mention is that Anthony Johnson, we know, is also black. Um, I don't believe that he was directly from Africa, probably second generation, born in the Caribbean, one of the English colonies in the Caribbean. Um, but he had an unusual life given that fact that he sued white people, that he owned slaves himself, that he was able to amass property, that he got support from rich white folks, and that later on that he was able to pass that on to his own children, who of course also were black. Um, the existence of someone like Anthony Johnson, and he's an extreme case, um, gives us some sense that it wasn't so fixed in stone in the early days of Jamestown that if one were either black or of African background, that one would definitely be a slave, and that slavery was a defining characteristic. Um, and that indicates that probably in the early days of Jamestown, that it wasn't fully defined as a society where that was based on slavery. There's some areas where there's some slippage. Although culturally it existed, and although of course to be a slave in any society is terrible and horrifying, obviously it didn't seem like it bothered Anthony Johnson that much to own people who look like him. But things are going to change, and in fact, Anthony Johnson in some ways died at the exact right time. His children would have a much tougher time. Now, the reason why the Jamestown colony, as it grew into the larger Virginia colony, didn't necessarily become a slave society at first was that although they did have slaves of African background, and although slaves were used as part of the labor force in the tobacco, economically, that didn't seem for a lot of the early Jamestown settlers like the best deal. And instead, although they do need a labor force, it's very important for them to get a force of workers who will make sure that the tobacco is grown and developed into the kind of profits that they can live off of and get wealthy from. For many of the early Jamestown settlers, this purchasing a slave, which is a horrifying thought, but also means purchasing a human being for their entire life, did not seem to a lot of the early Jamestown plantation owners like the best economic deal, uh, because you have to, in the hard calculus of slave owning, you have to feed that person their entire life. You have to provide shelter and clothing for them their entire life. And yet, that would include years when one would imagine, if they have survived at least, when a slave may not be able to work as hard. Instead, there was an alternate form of labor which was popular in England and other parts of Europe and was very popular here in the colonies in the early days called indentured servitude, where white people would be servants, would be working for and supporting these plantations or doing other kinds of jobs as well. England had a large surplus population. There are a lot of poor people in England who have very few opportunities. Their prospects are very weak. The likelihood, if you're born poor in England, is that you'll be poor for the rest of your life. Your children will be poor for the rest of their lives. Your grandchildren will be poor for the rest of their lives. The opportunities are essentially non existent. But if you're poor in England in the 1600s, there does seem to be an alternate possibility which could maybe alter the course of your fate, which is that there clearly are in these colonies, the English colonies that are just starting after Jamestown and then continuing in the Chesapeake and other parts, it seemed as if there are opportunities there. There's land there, for one thing. Now, of course, that land is owned by the Native Americans. Owned is a weird word because Native American understanding of property rights is not in any way the same as European based and certainly English based, but still, there's land. Um, Really, all it appeared to the Europeans they had to do to get land was to just come here and just start taking. And obviously, there's a fight involved there, and it's not really as simple as that. But compared to the situation, especially in England, where there's no land at all, there's a bunch of rich people, they own all the land, and everybody else is either living on those people's land and working for them or are crushed together in tight living conditions in the cities. The possibility of getting land, that seemed unimaginable in England. But it seems very imaginable if they could get over here to the colonies, because you get to Jamestown or some of the other early English colonies, and then from there, it sounded like all you had to do was then just go a little bit farther than the last white guy had gone, and then set yourself up there. And maybe you could even get wealthy. Not only own land, which is unimaginable for any poor person in England at the time, but to possibly actually get some wealth. That seemed like an extraordinary opportunity. And so there are plenty of poor people, poor white people in England, who are desperate to get to these colonies in the early days, especially after the initial starving time period was over. But how could they get here? Because they're poor. If we're talking about people who own nothing, who have no resources whatsoever, you can't get a bank loan. Instead, you need to figure out a way to get here, to pay for it, to get on a ship. And this is where an indenture comes in. An indenture is a contract. It is a deal between a person who all they have is their labor and someone else who needs that labor. By the term of the indenture, the person who will be the indentured servant promises to work for the person who's going to pay for them to get over to the new world for a period of time. Period of time change, it varied depending on the contract, but most typical was 7 years. So that's what I will define it as. So typically, an indentured servant is signing a contract and promising that they will work for someone else for a period of up to 7 years. In exchange, that person is going to pay their way all the way to get to the colonies, and then either that person is going to be the one that they work for, or maybe that person will sell the contract to some wealthy person in the colonies who needs labor. So, the way this worked is that the surplus of poor white people in England who are desperate to get out would trade a certain number of years, usually 7 years, of their life to get over to the New World, figuring that even if it took them 7 years of hard work on the plantations or doing other kinds of work that indentured servants might have done, after it was over, they were still young enough and robust enough that they could then get started on their own in a place that seemed to have limitless opportunities, at least as far as land was involved. So this is it's a big risk, but it provided a labor source that the plantation owners did take advantage of. The the cost of paying for an indentured servant to come over and then paying for their room and board was significantly less, especially over the course of a lifetime, than was the cost of purchasing a slave. And therefore, on pure economics, it seemed to a lot of the plantation owners like indentured servants were a better deal. But also, a lot of plantation owners liked indentured servants better than slaves as a potential labor force, not out of any moral questions or whatever. They think slavery is perfectly fine. They're just running the numbers in their head. As far as the plantation owners are concerned, they like the idea that they're getting indentured servants at the prime of their lives. Indentured servants are mostly male, although later on there are significant numbers of women as well. But for the indentured servants for the plantation, they're generally going to be male, and they're young. This isn't something you would do if you're 40. You're not going to say, "Oh, I'm going to go over to Jamestown and work for 7 years for some dude, and then after that try to start my life over," because at that point your life's mostly over. But in your teens or your 20s, you have your whole life ahead of you, and so that's a deal worth taking. But that's also meaning that you're at the prime of your physical peak. And so the plantation owners recognize that the advantage of indentured servitude was they get a labor force that they will work as hard as they can work them, and there are rules, but you know, um, work them as hard as they could for this period of 7 years, and then after that, let them go their merry way, and then hire new people who also were at the peak of their lives, the peak of their physical careers, and then afterwards they would move on as well. And so essentially, they would have a rotating force of people at their physical prime, and then just sort of move them off and replace them with other young people throughout their lives. So that seemed to the plantation owners like a good deal. And therefore, what happened was some of the plantations had white indentured servants doing the work. Some of the plantations had African slaves doing the work, and some had both, or went back and forth depending on what seemed like the best deal or what was available or whatever to the plantation owner. And so you have these two kinds of labor that are existing in Jamestown and in the Chesapeake as the Chesapeake developed, as the tobacco plantations developed in and throughout most of the 1600s. And the decision about which of those two kinds of labor forces that the plantation owner preferred would depend purely on economics, and maybe their own cultural predisposition about who they preferred to have working for them or whatever. The thing is, though, what happens to those indentured servants after they're not indentured servants anymore? They have been given the opportunity to come to the New World. They've been given the opportunity to come to a place where there seems to be land available, but now they have to actually see if they can make a life out of that. And so what happened is that as each generation of indentured servants got to the end of their contract and they were free to go, then at that point they would go out as far as the outskirts of the Jamestown colony, of the Virginia colony as it expanded. They would follow the rivers or go as, just keep going until they didn't see any white people anymore. And then they would try to establish themselves somewhere new, which means that the former indentured servants, as a labor force, they not only are working for 7 years for their bosses on the plantations that are making some success, but then afterwards they are starting from scratch in the wilderness, trying to set up farms and homesteads and so forth, and hoping if they're successful to someday be able to amass enough land holdings and so forth that maybe someday they'll be rich enough to hire their own indentured servants. But for the most part, they're never going to get to that because they are just getting started with essentially no resources. They have the shirt on their back and they've got strong bodies and a will to succeed, but they have no savings. They have nothing else that's going to allow them, other than their just physical force and whatever knowledge they've learned, picked up over the years. Sometimes at the end of a term of indenture, the former bosses would give them a set of tools, but that wasn't even part of the deal. Some former employers would give their former servants some land. Land essentially is very cheap, because there's areas farther away than any white people have gotten to that's really Native American land. And so, as part of the real estate deals in Jamestown in the 1600s, the wealthy people of the colony would basically just sort of draw lines on the map and say, well, I'm buying that and that belongs to me, but then not actually settle there. And then they could give that to their former indentured servants, or the former indentured servants would wind up in places like that anyway, out on the outskirts, farther out away from the most settled, the most developed parts of the colony. Essentially, what that meant was the former indentured servants are doing two things. They're keeping the plantations going while they're indentured servants, and then they are pushing the line of settlement deeper and deeper into the wilderness in the period after they were indentured servants. And the former indentured servants, essentially the development of a poor white working class in Jamestown and Virginia. These people are doing a lot of the fighting with the Native Americans because they're on that front line as the Virginia colony expanded. They are encroaching on new Native American territory with each successive generation. And therefore, these people who already are desperately poor, who are just trying to get started, who are poorly educated, and who have just spent multiple years working for somebody else, helping develop those other people's wealth, now they are start trying on in the wilderness, trying to scratch out a living at the exact place where no other white people have gotten to before, and any Native American who lives in the area, of course, is going to fight them first. So the former indentured servants, this white working class on the wilderness fringe of the Virginia colony, they do most of the day-to-day fighting with the Native Americans over land, an ongoing turf battle that typically the Native Americans lose in the long run, but day to day, individual white people of this working class, poor whites, some of them are doing poorly. And often what happens is that the former indentured servants wind up working for their old bosses eventually, because if they can't make a go of it, they try to scratch out a farm, and then eventually they just don't, they've lost all their savings or they're deeply in debt. And then they have to find someone to buy the one thing that they have, which is land. And frequently, then the rich people would buy up the farms of the former indentured servants who had failed, and then amass that together into one big plantation, and then hire as their labor force these former indentured servants. There's a lot of resentment that grew in the fringer part, the more wilderness areas of Virginia, as these former indentured servants get their freedom, go out, try to make a living, and are not successful. They're fighting a lot with the elements, they're fighting with the Native Americans whose land they're taking, and they're very resentful of the people back in Jamestown and back in the more settled parts of Virginia who it seemed were living the life of luxury while they did all the work. And so there's a lot of resentment. And the thing is that these former indentured servants, because they're basically that a whole generation of them is 7 years long, even though some of them don't survive that long and some of them get out and don't survive that long when they do get their own land. This means that the number of former indentured servants is growing and growing and growing. 7 years is not a long time. It's nowhere near a lifetime, not even half of a lifetime. So that number, the number of what I've already called the poor working class of Virginia, that number is growing. That number is increasing, and they are becoming a more significant force, and they're angry. They hate a lot of people. They hate the Native Americans because these former indentured servants, the white working class, the poor white farmers of Virginia, they're fighting the Native Americans tooth and nail over control of the territory, and some of them are dying, some of them are, being hurt, and so they feel resentment. But they also feel resentment toward the wealthy class and the political class who are running the colony, really for their own benefit and not in any way for the benefit of these poor white farmers. So that resentment grew over time. And eventually in 1676, it boiled over into a significant conflict that first started out as a conflict between the former indentured servants, the poor white farmers in the wilderness areas, and a local Native American tribe. Specifically, as I said, as these white territories encroached farther into Native American territory, there was fighting that went on. And in this particular occasion, a Native American tribe attacked a settlement of poor white farmers, and some of the poor white Virginians were killed. Um, the rules at the time, the laws of the colony of Virginia said that in order to get permission to attack any Native American, you had to go to the governor and request to be able to do that, because the policies that were coming all the way from England with regards to Native American policy, they were trying at the time to figure out ways to maybe not have as much conflict. So, uh, the survivors and their neighbors in this outskirt territory requested permission from the governor of Virginia, uh, based out of Jamestown, a guy named Lord Berkeley, asked him for permission to go after the Native American tribe that had attacked them and killed some of their family members. But that permission was denied. The governor refused because, as far as the governor was concerned, the problems of this one particular community were less important than the overall policy of trying not to create any bigger issues with the Native Americans, which could lead to full scale warfare. So they were not given permission to go and respond to this attack on their community. Very angry. Angry already at what they felt was, constant fighting with the Native Americans, angry about the deaths of some of their neighbors, and angry now at the governor who, it seemed to them, represented not their point of view, but the point of view of people who are wealthy and elites. So they're looking for some sort of response. As it turned out, there was a fairly recent settler in this area, a wealthy guy named Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon had moved out to this fringe area, this sort of outskirts area of Virginia, and we're fairly far away from Jamestown at this point. Had moved there fairly recently. He had wealth, but because he was a recent arrival, he wasn't able to purchase or live near Jamestown. He had bought some land out farther out and was trying to set himself up as a plantation owner there. But therefore, he has some of the same problems as the poor white farmers of his community, but he's better educated. So, in the anger and the tumultuous feelings that happened after this attack and after the governor refused to give them permission to respond, in the meetings that followed, eventually a lot of the local poor white farmers turned to Nathaniel Bacon as sort of a natural leader because he was better educated. And ultimately became clear that they wanted revenge, that they wanted to go after the Native American tribe. They asked Nathaniel Bacon if he would lead them, and he said that he would because he felt that they were on the right side. And so Bacon and his men went and attacked a Native American community, murdered a lot of them, and then afterwards came back to their settlement, and they felt better about themselves because they had gotten revenge for the death of their neighbors and friends. It's worth pointing out here the Native American tribe they attacked was not the Native American tribe that had attacked them in the first place. I don't really know what to tell you about that. As far as I can say, Bacon and his men probably thought that killing any Native American would be revenge for the Native American attack on their community. We'll leave it at that. Um, However, once the governor, Lord Berkeley, found out that this attack had taken place, he was very angry because they had expressly gone against what he had told them that they were allowed to do, and he demanded that Bacon and his men come into Jamestown to receive punishment. Now, Bacon and his men know what that punishment is going to be. It's not going to be good. But there's a lot of them, and they represent this fairly large group of poor white farmers who have reason to be upset with the governor and with the overall leadership of the colony. And Bacon and his men realize that, why should we go accept punishment? Let's just go fight it out. Um, so they head toward Jamestown with the idea that they're not going to, come in lightly. They're going to try to fight their way and take control of the colony. This becomes known as Bacon's Rebellion, and it's in 1676. I noticed that this is a lecture that has both ham and bacon in it, so depending on when you're watching this, if it's breakfast time, you can go deal with that if you have that in your house, if that's still in the fridge. Um, but otherwise, it's just a weird coincidence. Um, Bacon's rebellion turns into an effort to basically gain control of the colony, to overthrow Lord Berkeley and the leaders of the Virginia colony, to head into Jamestown and take over by force. And I have to say, the sequence of events probably made it easier for these guys to imagine using force. They have, after all, just used force in revenge against Native Americans, and it's probably easier to imagine violence once you've already committed violence. So, Bacon and his men attacked Jamestown, tried to take over. It failed. Bacon himself died, and with their leadership gone and some other things that happened, it turned out Jamestown was better protected than they guessed. There was a militia that was able to defend the town, but ultimately, Bacon's rebellion failed. And the survivors, there's a lot of punishment of them, but after it's over, the leaders of the colony in Jamestown, the other important Virginia elites, looked at this and they realized that they had come very close to a catastrophe. If this had been a little bit later, if there were even more poor white farmers, former indentured servants, then maybe Bacon's rebellion would have succeeded because the numbers indicate that that group of the colony is growing. Every 7 years, they basically turn over an entire generation of indentured servants who then go out into the woods and try to set themselves up with all these angers and resentments that they're carrying. And the leaders of the colony realized from the experience of Bacon's Rebellion that that was dangerous. They felt socially dangerous because the resentments of the poor white farmers weren't things that they were going to address. those resentments would continue to grow. And if the size of that poor white underclass of the colony continued to grow exponentially, well, then the next time there was a Bacon's Rebellion, the likelihood was the farmers would win and the elites would lose. So the lesson learned by the elite leaders in Virginia was that white indentured servants were dangerous. Not while they were servants, but what would happen afterwards. If there's a swelling class of angry, poor white farmers, that eventually that class of people would just outnumber and dominate and eventually take over the colony. And that was too dangerous a prospect to imagine. And so, therefore, in the years following Bacon's Rebellion, the political and economic elites of the Virginia colony made the conscious decision to de emphasize white indentured servitude. Instead, they began to emphasize African or African American slavery as their main labor force. Partly this was economic. The price of slaves had decreased over the decades, and that's a horrifying concept to imagine that they're basing this decision on how much does a person cost. But that calculus is involved there. The price overall had gone down, and therefore this economic decision, this balancing act that they had made, seemed also to be more in favor of slaves. But also the elites of in and around Jamestown, throughout Virginia, felt that white people would be harder to boss around. They believed, based on their racist preconceptions of people from Africa, they believed that Africans and then their descendants as African American slaves would be easier to control, less likely to fight back, and therefore a labor force that they could continue for generations to come to force to work for them to create this wealth that they could enjoy. And therefore, slavery became the emphasis and essentially the underpinning of the economics throughout the Chesapeake. Late 1600s, slavery numbers pick up significantly, indentured servant numbers drop off. This decision made consciously by the elites of first Jamestown and Virginia, and then eventually also by the people in Maryland on the other side of the Chesapeake. They learned by seeing what had happened in Virginia and didn't want to have it happen to them as well. And essentially, slavery became the economic basis of these colonies and therefore fundamental to the social and cultural understanding of who they were as a colony and as a people. Because once they made the decision that slavery was going to be the basis of their economy, then they also had stricter laws imposing and enforcing slavery and made the definition of slavery equals black and black equals slave much tighter. You can't have an Anthony Johnson after Bacon's Rebellion. It's simply not possible. In fact, Anthony Johnson's children, who inherited his property, including some slaves, by the end of their lives had lost all that property, had lost the right to sue in court, and eventually, most of them, we don't really know what happened to them, but our best guess is that a few generations later, some of them wound up enslaved themselves, because the entire white community came together in a definition of slavery as fundamentally important and therefore something that they would defend and make sure that it perpetuated into the future. From that point on, plantation societies, plantation colonies here in the English colonies are going to emphasize slavery as their labor force and not so much indentured servitude, which is going to have long-term ramifications, of course, for the slaves, but also for the development of these colonies and later for the United States. Next class, we're going to move on next Tuesday and work our way up the coast. There's a set of other English colonies that will be established in a very different way, with a very different set of ideologies, predicated largely on religion. We'll be talking about the Puritans, and by the time we're done with that one, you'll know much more about religion than you ever wanted to know. I will see you then. Thanks. And hey, do me a favor. I'm not hearing that much from you guys, so shoot me an email. Let me know what you thought of this lecture, of today's two lectures, and what did you learn from it? What are some of the key ideas? I look forward to hearing you soon, and I will see you on the other side of my laptop. I know you're in there somewhere. Thanks. Bye.